funded by Comisiún na Man with the television licence fee.
One of the most potent legends to emerge from the First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, is the legend of the Angels of Mons. Now, believe it or not, many experts contend that the primary inspiration for this legend was a soldier named Thomas Fitzpatrick from Drumcormac in County Wexford. Ronan McGreevy, author of the book Wherever the Firing Line Extends, Ireland and the Western Front.
Thomas Fitzpatrick. He's best known for an incident in the First World War which inspired what's called the Angels of Mons. This is a story a myth that arose from the first battle between the British and the Germans, which occurred at the Battle of Mons on the 23rd of August 1914, in which the British managed to escape the Germans, who had a numerical advantage of about 5-1. As a consequence of that, a myth grew up that the British were saved by the bowmen from the Battle of Agincourt, who appeared in the skies over Mons and started to fell the German attackers with arrows from the sky. It was, of course, totally made up, but some people chose to believe it as the only way.
The story was about the retreating British soldiers and how angels with bows and arrows had thrown a protective curtain around them. They halted the Germans from advancing and saved the British troops from disaster. The story went viral in Britain and around the world. The popular version of the story was that it was angels who had stopped the evil Germans from advancing.
County Wexford historian Des Keeley. Now, in reality, it wasn't angels who opposed a German advance at Mons in Belgium in 1914, but instead a number of military units, in particular one ad hoc unit led by Thomas Fitzpatrick of the Royal Irish Regiment. Now, in September 1914, just over 1 month after the actual Battle of Mons, the Welsh journalist Arthur Machen, inspired in part by the heroic rearguard action of Thomas Fitzpatrick's unit at the Mons salient, published a short story in London's largest circulation newspaper, the Evening News, which mixed fact and fiction. Ronan McGreevy.
Machen is reading reports in the newspapers about the Battle of Mons, and he talks about the Mons salient, and this is where Fitzpatrick would have made the stand. A salient in military terms is a bulge into the opposing lines, into the enemy's lines. So he says that, with the permission of the censor, I'll talk about. So he mixed up fact with fiction, and the fact was what Fitzpatrick and his men from the 2nd Royal Irish Regiment did, and the fiction is obviously he made up the story about the angels.
In his fictional story, the Welsh journalist Arthur Machen described how at one critical moment in the Battle of Mons, the soldiers on the British side were assailed by a German attack so terrifying that just as annihilation seemed likely, otherworldly bowmen from the medieval Battle of Agincourt divinely appeared to defeat the German forces.
There was one point above all other points in our battle line that was for a time in awful danger, not merely of defeat, but of utter annihilation. With the permission of the censor and of the military expert, this corner may perhaps be described as a salient, and if this angle were crushed and broken, then the English force as a whole would be shattered, the Allied left would be turned, and Sedan would inevitably follow.
Sedan referring to the cataclysmic French defeat during the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, out of which the German Empire was born. That same German Empire with whom Britain, of which Ireland was then a part, was now at war. The Englishmen whom Machen mentioned in his story were in reality a mix of Irish and Scots. Now, in his story, Machen described how the soldiers were assailed by a German attack so terrifying that just as annihilation seemed certain, there was a divine intervention.
And as the soldier heard these voices, he saw before him, beyond the trench, a long line of shapes with a shining above them, They were like men who drew the bow, and with another shout, the cloud of arrows flew singing and tingling through the air towards the German hosts.
Soon after Arthur Machen published his story, the legend of the Angels of Mons went viral and quickly transplanted the truth, Ronan McGreevy.
It's a great story, and
but the truth of the matter is, the person, if you want to call it the real angel, is an Irishman.
Yeah, that's true. Thomas William Fitzpatrick.
This radio documentary aims to show that Thomas Fitzpatrick of the Royal Irish Regiment was the actual Angel of Mons, in that his exemplary leadership and heroic actions on the 23rd of August 1914 at Mons in Belgium inspired Arthur Machen's published story, which gave birth to the legend of the Angels of Mons in the first place. Irish Defence Forces Commandant retired Larry Scallum.
The successful retrograde operation conducted by the Royal Irish Regiment from Mons, when they were in heavy fire from a vastly superior force of German soldiers and army, and how this imponderable stopping of those forces by an amazingly small number of men, led by a Wexford man from a little village, born in a little village called Duncormac, County Wexford, was able to personally, using all I could call it amazing leadership, to get his men to actually gallantly bring such quantity and quality of fire down on a massive army that they stopped them. And this pause, this forceful stop in the battle allowed thousands of British soldiers to successfully withdraw under the cover of darkness on August the 23rd to fight another day. It's such an unbelievable fact that the only way that it could be reconciled with, in reality, was the intercession of God.
The famous miracle of Mons has been reported widely.
A heavenly intervention saving the British Army from destruction.
The Angels of Mons. We know some of it's probably based on folklore, but it's around the facts of the actual Battle of Mons at the end of the day. But the soldier who inspired the Angels of Mons legend more than any other was Thomas Fitzpatrick from Duncormac in County Wexford.
Yeah, the inspiration for the legend of the Angels of Mons would have been Thomas Fitzpatrick.
So yeah, Thomas Fitzpatrick was the inspiration for the legend of the Angels of Mons.
And before we hear more about how Thomas Fitzpatrick was the inspiration for the Angels of Mons legend, first we need to investigate his County Wexford roots. County Wexford historian Des Keeley.
Thomas was born in Duncormac in 1879. His father was also Thomas and his mother was Anastasia Connolly. Thomas was the eldest of 5 children and his father was a member of the Royal Irish Constabulary. He was assigned to Duncormac Station. In 1887 the family were living in Galbally.
That being Galbally village situated near Enniscorthy in County Wexford. Now in 1891, at the age of 11, the young Thomas Fitzpatrick was enrolled in St Aidan's Academy in Enniscorthy, where he spent over 4 years. After completing his education there, in October 1895, at the age of 16, he enlisted in the Royal Irish Regiment, which had its main depot in Clonmel, County Tipperary, and was part of the British Army. So just how common was it for Irishmen to join the British Army during this period? Dr. Brian Hughes, of the Department of History in Mary Immaculate College, Limerick.
There are opportunities there in the British Army for young Irishmen. A very high proportion of the British Army officers and British Army rank and file in the late 19th century were Irish born, and Irishmen served all over the world in the British Army.
So what motivated Irishmen to join the British Army? Historian Brian Kenny of the Irish Great War Society.
Sometimes it'll be financial. Sometimes young men want a sense of adventure. They want to see other parts of the world, and what better than to join the army, who will be based all over the world.
So just what training did Thomas Fitzpatrick undergo once he joined the army in 1895?
The first thing would be drill. You join the army as an individual, but once you're in there, you have to become part of a team, part of a unit, doing everything together. Also discipline, essential discipline. If you're in the middle of a battle, you must learn to obey orders. Your other men could rely on that. And even more essential was your rifle training. This was essential. You had to hit 15 shots a minute on target. That was the minimum requirement for a new recruit.
And after 12 months of intensive training, in November 1896 at the age of 17, Thomas Fitzpatrick was posted along with others of the Royal Irish Regiment to the northwest frontier in India. Military historian Gerard Whelan.
What would happen is these regiments would be posted around the world. I mean, the empire the sun didn't set on it, so there was a lot of coverage to be done. So, for example, the Royal Irish Regiment would have been dispatched to India and then up to the northwest frontier, which is Pakistan, Afghanistan. And conditions were very, very hot. You must remember there was no air conditioning, food rationing would have been poor. It was a very, very aggressive campaign to be involved with.
During his time in the northwest frontier, Thomas Fitzpatrick was involved in combat against local tribes. Military historian Clement Roach.
He was awarded the Indian Service Medal with 2 clasps, which was Punjab and Samana clasps. Now, this is a series of rebellion by tribes in this period, rebelling against British control of their tribal lands. So he got that campaign medal, so we knew that he was, as a young man, in action pretty quick when he got there.
So the fact that he served there would have toughened him up and would have, if you'd have to have proper grit to survive that. And he got some of his promotions there as well.
By 1902, Thomas Fitzpatrick had risen up the ranks to become a colour sergeant. That same year he returned with his regiment to Ireland after over 6 years' service in India. 2 years later, in 1904, he married Mary Jane Wagner from County Cork. Now, by the year 1910, they had 3 children, and Fitzpatrick had been promoted to the position of Regimental Quartermaster Sergeant. Military historian John Goodman.
He's a quartermaster sergeant, so that's a massively important role within the battalion. He's responsible for all sorts of stuff, like making sure that there's enough food, ammunition. He's responsible basically for everything other than commanding where they go. He's the linchpin between the officer part of the corps and the rest of the battalion.
Right, so he's the logistics man, making sure that there's enough food, enough supplies, enough all the gear and everything that's needed to keep an army supplied.
Pretty much, yeah. And also as well, like it would come into elements of discipline as well, that the other sergeants and other company sergeant majors are not quite reporting into him, but he is the central. They're going through him if he's not actually the rank above them. So massively important.
On the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and the First World War began. And shortly after war was declared, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment, of which Thomas Fitzpatrick was part, was shipped from Devonport in England to France. Larry Scallon.
It just so happened that the 2nd Battalion Royal Irish Regiment was in Devonport, and that's why they ended up in that first batch of soldiers in France.
Well, what happens then is the British Army and the French Army advance into Belgium, as we all know, and they're caught in the Schieffelin plan of the German Army. So you had these German armies, 3 German armies, basically coming in with a right hook into Belgium and trying to get into France to basically capture Paris and knock the French out of the war. And what happens is that the British Army advanced to meet them in the Mons area of Belgium, and we get a series of battles.
Clement Roach. Here's Des Keeley.
It was Sunday, the 23rd of August 1914, when the first major engagement of the war between the British and German forces occurred outside of the old Belgian coal mining town of Mons, about 10 miles from the French border. And the British reached Mons that day and agreed to hold the line at the Mons-Condé Canal for 24 hours in order to prevent the advancing Germans from surrounding the French forces. Now, the canal ran through what was then an important coal mining area surrounded by slag heaps, and it was the intention of the British to hold the Germans on the northern side of the canal. The 2nd Royal Irish Regiment formed part of the 8th Infantry of the 3rd Division of the British Army, totalling about 4,000 men. Some had fought together in the Boer War and in India, but Thomas was a quartermaster and not a frontline soldier.
Tom Fitzpatrick's not a frontline soldier. He's a senior NCO who's responsible for logistics. He's a regimental quartermaster sergeant. His job is to, with brigade headquarters, the logistics element of brigade headquarters, to get the allocated weapons and equipment to resupply the Royal Irish Regiment. Tom happened to be up there that day, and he was talking to the adjutant of the Royal Irish Regiment. He asked the adjutant, could he stay in location? Because all the wagons and all had been emptied, the commissariat wagons, as they called them at the time, the logistics wagons with the ammunition, with the food and all that were empty, and they were sent back. And Tom Fitzpatrick asked to stay, and he was allowed to stay. So Thomas Fitzpatrick gets permission to stay by his adjutant, but he's not deployed with the forward. The battalion is a number of companies, so the companies are all spread out in their own areas, and Thomas Fitzpatrick is to the rear of all that, in an area where he has a little bit of access to a little bit of higher ground, and he has a pair of binoculars, and he's seen everything that's going on. Because if you go to Mons, if you go to Belgium and Flanders, you will see this is flat country. Do you know, it's very easy to see what's going on around you.
Larry Scallum. And what Thomas Fitzpatrick saw was the British Army, which was badly outnumbered, coming under heavy attack from German forces. John Goodman.
The British, they were in their positions, and the Germans then started attacking. Heavy machine gun fire, artillery fire. So the Germans are attacking, and the British they're holding the ground, but they are being slowly forced back into different places, and there's a constant level of reorganisation going on. But they're losing officers and they're losing men all the time, and when you're heavily outnumbered like that, any loss is going to be felt.
So the day goes on, and Thomas Fitzpatrick is observing all this with his binoculars, slightly to the rear, out of immediate danger, and he understands the battlefield. He sees what's happening. What they are doing is they're enveloping the Royal Irish Regiment, which means they're surrounding them from both sides. Very slowly, but it's happening, right? So Thomas Fitzpatrick then rallies his group of cooks and soldiers that are not frontline soldiers, but they're with him because he's the battalion quartermaster sergeant, and they're his work party. And he gets them, and they form a hasty defensive position.
And that hasty defensive position was formed at the Labascoul crossroads in Mons. Larry Scallum.
There's a crossroads of a road going east-west and a road going north-south. He sees this as being decisive terrain. And decisive terrain is if we lose this ground, we're going to lose the battle. But as long as I can hold this position, we're going to be able to allow our soldiers to withdraw behind us and hold off the German advance.
In other words, Thomas Fitzpatrick and his ad hoc unit, which numbered an estimated 40 to 50 men, initiated what in military lore is called a rear guard action. So what exactly is a rear guard action? Military historian James Taylor.
A rear guard action is to allow the main body of the force to withdraw and minimise the amount of casualties and to avoid them being surrounded. But basically, if you're fighting a rearguard action, you could be a sacrificial lamb.
Rearguard actions are basically the last hope of an army escaping.
Clement Roach. Here's Gerard Whelan.
the rear guard is not a great place to be, because really what you are is you're the sponge that's going to soak up everything to allow everybody else to escape. If you're in the rear guard, you're not really expected to survive, or at least you're not expected to survive in great and be intact, because what you're supposed to do is blunt the enemy as they come at you.
And give your army enough time to get away.
Yeah. It's the rock that you're supposed to perish on. And in fairness to Thomas Fitzpatrick and his motley crew of people, managed to hold back the brunt of the German forces and to blunt that attack, because they were never going to stop the Germans coming through. But what they could do was slow them down, or make them think twice, or make them, actually stop and survey and say, how are we going to get past this?
Thomas Fitzpatrick, he was able to set up a position that the Germans couldn't bypass, they couldn't go around, because they were given this advantage area. So his rearguard action was to prevent them taking the actual piece of ground he was standing on, therefore allowing all his colleagues, all his fellow soldiers to disappear into the background.
Larry Scallon. However, as the bulk of the British Army disappeared to safety, Thomas Fitzpatrick and his 40 to 50 men now faced a German military juggernaut coming at them. John Goodman.
You've got a small detachment of men, and they're bearing the full weight of the German offensive attack. So they're completely outnumbered.
This was the whole German army coming towards them.
Brian Kenny.
And the courage they showed that day, the face that was incredible.
All the time artillery's firing, there's, bullets are flying every which direction.
You can imagine you're in that trench, you're firing the gun, the noise, the explosions, and you're watching men that you've served with fall on either side of you, and you must keep fighting. You have to keep firing, you have to hold the line. That's real courage for you.
It's extremely perilous, and you can see even by the numbers, if they were down to approximately 17 men by the time they were finished, that's well over 50% of men lost.
And despite the gargantuan German army bearing down on them, nevertheless Thomas Fitzpatrick and his men held the line, thus helping as part of a concerted effort by several military units to allow the British Army to escape and live to fight another day. Now, the success of their rearguard action was down to several factors, including their professional training and also their Lee Enfield 303 rifles. Larry Scallon.
The British Army was tiny in comparison to the other armies at the start of World War I, but they were way advanced in their training. So much so that the Germans who were attacking them that day thought that every soldier was armed with a machine gun.
But instead he was armed with a 303 Lee Enfield rifle, am I correct?
Yes. Yeah. And they had 6-round magazines or 7-round magazines, I'm not exactly sure, but they were trained so well that they could fire, change magazines and fire again, which meant that the Germans just thought everybody had a machine gun.
Now, to find out more about the Lee Enfield 303 rifle, I asked Brian Kenny of the Irish Great War Society to show me one.
This is the Lee Enfield 303 small magazine Lee Enfield. It holds around 10 rounds. This is what it sounds like. Load, fire. That's exactly what it have to do, continuously over and over and over again. So you're in a trench with 40 to 50 men firing these guns, and you're trying to keep your concentration, and that's where your drill and your training comes in, to keep doing that time after time after time, reload, and reload.
And these guys were super efficient at firing these guns. They could do it blindfolded.
They could strip it blindfolded, keep it going. If it got dirty, strip it, get it going again, and get it back in action as quick as they could. And those Germans are advancing towards them, and Fitzpatrick is waiting, and it's the discipline that stops them from firing. And once he gives that order, they let him have it. They fire.
But it wasn't just expert marksmanship that helped Thomas Fitzpatrick and his men to succeed in their rearguard action at Mons in Belgium in August 1914. Also, they were extremely lucky to retrieve a machine gun, Gerard Whelan.
Thomas Fitzpatrick managed to get his hands on this machine gun that it was a British machine gun, but the crew had been killed. And he went out of his way and got that machine gun and brought it back. Now this is capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute.
The machine gun. It's a great piece of kit if you have it for a defensive position, because you can impede the advance, or else you can make them keep their heads down.
Historian James Scannell of the Brakehulen Historical Society. Here's Irish Defence Forces Commandant retired Larry Scallon.
Here you have one piece of weaponry which is man-portable by 4 men that you can position, you can get low, and you can fire your bullets for a sustained period of time. That means, and if you can point, so you're not aiming at an individual when you're firing a machine gun. You're aiming to have a beaten zone, which is like a cone shape landing where the rounds all land. And if you can have a landing zone of like up to 100 metres wide and 200 metres long, that's a lot of soldiers you can take out in a period of time.
That machine gun, it was essential because normally there's 2 machine guns to every regiment, but here they only had 1 machine gun to keep the Germans back, and they did keep them back, and that machine gun was vital to keep the German troops back from the British lines at that time.
Brian Kenny. And a key factor in Fitzpatrick's unit's success in keeping the Germans at bay was their effective use of their single machine gun. Larry Scallon.
Thomas Fitzpatrick, he was with his troops, but I would suggest he probably wasn't pulling the trigger of the machine gun. Because he would know that Private Jones, who was a cook, hey, you were with me 4 years ago, you can fire that, can't you? I can, Sarge, get in there. You know, he knew how to find the expertise within the body of soldiers. He had to fire the gun. He was watching, he was adjusting fire. He would be telling them, listen, aim 200 yards to your right there. You know, adjust fire up. You're firing too short. Raise the range to 1400. They'd range the range. You know, he was doing all the fire control and the direction of fire. And that would have been really, really important, that you had somebody that understood. It wasn't just being able to fire the gun, it was being able to make sure the rounds were landing in the right place. And but look, it was heroic. It was, today, unless you knew it happened, you mightn't believe it. I'm surprised it wasn't turned into an epic film for 20th Century Fox or something, because it's deserving of it.
Thomas Fitzpatrick and his men, what they were able to do is put up such a fuss that the Germans thought that they were dealing with a much bigger portion of men than what they were actually doing. And that indecision is what allowed the French, and I would imagine a lot of the British, to escape.
It lasted for most of the day. They did not pull out until about 11 o'clock that night. So they had almost 12 hours of constant firing to try and hold those Germans back.
Out of the estimated 40 to 50 men in Thomas Fitzpatrick's unit, only 17 survived. Now, their heroic rearguard action at Mons on the 23rd of August 1914 was part of a wider effort by several military units to halt the German army long enough so that British forces could safely escape. So just how critical were such rearguard actions in the wider arc of the war? Ronan McGreevy, historian and also author of the book Wherever the Firing Line Extends, Ireland and the Western Front.
Absolutely critical, because you see what could have happened. There was only 6 British divisions in France in 1914 and Belgium in 1914, and the Germans' First Army alone had 1 million men. And had they managed to capture the British at Mons, or had managed to surround the British at Mons, it would have been the end of the war, because the British would have, that was basically the entirety of the British army that they could put into the field in August 1914. So that battle was absolutely critical in ensuring that the British army lived to fight another day, or else it could have been another Dunkirk, where they would have had to flee back across the channel, and the war would have been over within a couple of days.
And as was mentioned at the beginning of this radio documentary, over a month after the Battle of Mons in August 1914, The Welsh journalist Arthur Machen, inspired in part by the actions of Thomas Fitzpatrick and his men during the Battle of Mons, published a short story in London's largest circulation newspaper, the Evening News. The story claimed that when the British Army was in mortal danger of being utterly annihilated at the Battle of Mons, St George and bowmen from the medieval Battle of Agincourt divinely intervened to repulse the German army and save the day for the British. Military historian Clement Roach.
Arthur Machen was a newspaper reporter for the Evening News in the United Kingdom. Machen took that battle on that day from men that were holding that line and came up with that story and twisted it into that supernatural where St George and all the archers of Agincourt decided to help the British Army.
And although Machen's story was pure fiction, nevertheless many people believed it as fact, and it became popularly known as the legend of the Angels of Mons. So just how did the British War Office react to the story once it went viral? Military historian James Taylor.
I would imagine their initial reaction was, what a load of rubbish. But then, could this be used for political purposes? Now, it would be great evidence to show that God is on our side, not the German belt buckle saying Gott mit uns, that we've got God on our side. There's the evidence, and let the propaganda run with it. I mean, it wasn't going to do them any harm to show that even though they were after having a major defeat, retreating from the Germans, that, look at lads, it doesn't matter, God's on our side, we're going to win.
The British War Office and that would have played this up to the biggest thing ever, I'd say, because the retreat from Mons was a defeat for the British Army. So they had to be able to spin that story to say, oh, no, it wasn't retreat. We didn't lose the battle. We just...
we won the defence.
Yeah, we won the defence. But yeah, that's you get the idea that this is propaganda at its best, that God was on the British side.
Clement Roach. Here's Ronan McGreevy.
The end result is that people believe that the War Office did nothing to dampen down the story. Why would they?
And not only did the War Office do nothing to dampen down the story, but instead it did everything possible to milk the legend for all it was worth, even tipping off the British press from time to time. Des Keeley.
The British press were still getting claims from, in quotes, anonymous British Army officers that corpses of dead German soldiers found at Mons had been pierced by arrow wounds from the Angels. Soldiers themselves began to bring back reports of heavenly interventions. It's believed that these stories were part of a covert attempt by the British War Office to spread morale-boosting propaganda.
And despite the British War Office's propaganda and spin doctoring, nevertheless many experts contend that Quartermaster Sergeant Thomas Fitzpatrick from County Wexford was the actual real-life Angel of Mons, in that his exemplary leadership and heroic actions on the 23rd of August 1914 at Labascoul Crossroads in Mons were the primary inspiration behind Arthur Machen's published Bowmen story, which gave birth to the legend of the Angels of Mons in the first place. Now in this regard, I had this question to ask military historian Gerard Whelan.
Who is the Angel of Mons in your estimation?
I think it could be fair to say, look, in a beautiful Irish bias, that it's Thomas Fitzpatrick.
Why?
Why? Because it was his acts and his agility and his mental ability and his ability to pull these non-combat soldiers around him together to put up this monumental defence that slows down and blunts the edge of the German attack long enough for the French and, more importantly, the British elements to get away. Okay, the one thing I would probably hold back on that is I'm sure there were other great men in the battle over those few days who probably assisted our Angel of Mons in defending and keeping the armies intact. So, yeah, is it fair to say? I think it is.
So in other words, we're not going to gild the lily and say that he deserves all the credit, but definitely, you know, if you're joining the dots, he's the guy who kind of sticks out, you know, I mean, very prominent up there and deserves the title. Yeah, really, yeah.
Well, look, the fact that people after the war remembered that particular event in all the different events. You must remember, you have Passchendaele, you have the 3 battles of Ypres, you have all of this thing going on, Verdun, the Somme, and yet people remember this one event. Why? Because it was so important at that time that this stopped the Germans from routing the French and the British. Now, they did rout the British at Le Cateau, but they didn't rout the French at Le Cateau. But they could have routed the French at Mons. So if you had Mons as a failure, and then you had Le Cateau as a failure, there probably would have been no defence left.
Is he an angel? Yeah. For that particular moment on that particular day, yes. Maybe he was possibly the most critical person in the British Army on that day, at that time, at that hour. You can have these moments that a whole army is advancing and it gets held up.
Military historian John Goodman. Here is Brian Kenny.
Thomas Fitzpatrick that day showed courage. Where he got that courage from, was it divine intervention? I don't know, but it was an incredible act of bravery.
There was something very special about how he managed his resources and how he got the results that he got that day.
He was the man in charge, so you could give him the title of the Angel of Mons.
But yeah, he'd definitely be thereabouts for being named, the Angel of Mons.
The Mons Tourism Board, if you go to Mons Tourism and you say to them, can you tell me where I will find the location of the Angels of Mons, they'll send you to La Bascule, the crossroads, and that's where it is with Thomas Fitzpatrick.
Ronan McGreevy. Here's Clement Roach.
Still an inspiration to see today that if people are talking about the Angel of Mons, is where most Belgian people will say to you have to go to La Bascule, and there at that crossroads is where that incident is supposed to be after happening. So yeah, it's in the folk memory there of the people, that this crossroads is famous for that action that day.
The fact that the tourist office will tell you to go see this, it's very important to them. And whether we think there was angels or not, or whether something did happen, to the Belgian people, that's where that happened. So it's very important to them. So I wouldn't actually discount them saying, if you want to go see the Angel of Mons, go out there, because that's where this happened.
John Goodman. During the 1920s, a 3-metre high Irish Celtic cross was erected at La Bascule Crossroads in Mons in Belgium to commemorate the men of the Royal Irish Regiment, such as Thomas Fitzpatrick, who helped to defend Belgian freedom during the 1914-18 war. Brian Kenny of the Irish Great War Society.
If you go into Mons, you have to go to the crossroads of La Bascule to see the Celtic cross. It's just like another ordinary crossroads, but this monument, it's not just, it's a monument to courage and bravery. And these men, what they did on that day, epitomises courage. They held their nerve as well as holding the line, but that's an essential area to visit if you go to Mons as a First World War tour.
I bring coach tours to the Western Front every spring and autumn, and that is one of our places that we visit.
Ronan McGreevy.
There's an Irish flag there, there's a Belgian flag, and then there's the flag of the European Union. So it sort of conveys solidarity between Belgium and Ireland.
This beautiful Celtic cross, which is a symbol of Irish Christianity from the medieval times, early medieval times, and you definitely get the significance of it, because here you're in a country in mainland Europe, you're there in the 21st century, and you're looking at this piece of granite or stone that's there, and it's there almost 100 years. It's 100 years this year, and you're saying, wow, this is really significant.
Irish Defence Forces Commandant retired Larry Scallon. Here's Ronan McGreevy once again.
It's a very interesting memorial, and it kind of stops you in your tracks when you see it, because it's like a Celtic cross and you're going, what the hell's this doing here? I mean, this is the middle of a Belgian town, So that's part of the joy of it,
But that's how important that Irish contribution to the bigger war effort is felt by the Belgian people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Belgians should feel strongly about that. 13,000 Irishmen died in Flanders in the First World War, so, and
13,000?
Yeah, 13,000 died in Flanders. So, I make the point when I go to France and Belgium that more people died in the defence of Belgium and the defence of France advanced and died in the creation of the state we now live in.
The Belgian people themselves, they said this is hugely important. We are so grateful to the Irish troops that came out here and helped free us.
John Goodman.
And we kind of forget ourselves here, you know. I think we've a tendency to navel gaze in Ireland about our own history and our own relationship with Britain. But we forget that other countries have all their little rivalries and they have their shared history. So the Belgian people are very grateful to those who did liberate them.
It's an innate Irish thing to understand the need to fight for, or see the reason to fight for, peace. And Belgium being a predominantly Christian country at the time, it was really important that we helped them out. And countries like Belgium today, like France today, particularly the north of France there, they understand that sacrifice. And they will embrace you as an Irish person today, almost like you were a long lost friend.
I think there's a really close connection with the Belgians.
Marianne Marr, Secretary of the 18th Regiment of Foot Royal Irish Regiment and South Irish Horse Association.
Look, it goes back to, I suppose, Belgium is a small country, Ireland is a small country. You know, they recognise the difference between the Irish involvement with the British Army, and there's a real strong appreciation for what those men undertook to try and protect the people.
And some of those Irishmen who did their best to protect Belgian people and their freedom were Thomas Fitzpatrick and his comrades from the Royal Irish Regiment. Their heroic rearguard action at Labascoul Crossroads in Mons on the 23rd of August 1914 helped, as part of a wider effort by several military units, to save the British Army from destruction. That was already touched on. Nowadays a Celtic cross at Labascoul Crossroads in Mons commemorates the Royal Irish Regiment's fight for Belgian freedom. Gerard Whelan.
The fact that a good Wexford man, you know, who has got solid British Army training and has the agility, as I said, and the speed of thought to pull these non-combatants together and put up the biggest stance and the biggest fight, that people years later are still happy to put up a monument to Thomas Fitzpatrick and his friends. It might be the Royal Irish Regiment, but really it's to those Irishmen who did their job that day.
So just how did Thomas Fitzpatrick's army career go after the Battle of Mons in August 1914? Brian Kenny.
He was gassed twice actually in 1915, but he actually survived the war. He retired in 1949.
And that retirement in 1949 was after over 50 years in the army. Now, despite his lengthy and distinguished military career, Thomas Fitzpatrick is perhaps best known for the heroic role which he played in the Battle of Mons in August 1914. Des Keeley.
For his gallantry at the Battle of Mons, Thomas Fitzpatrick received the Distinguished Conduct Medal from the British government. He also received the Médaille Militaire from the French, that's the French equivalent of the Victoria Cross, and the Order of St. George from Russia.
The actual action that he did was incredible. And to my mind, actually, when you read it, it would probably be more deserving of a VC than a DCM.
DCM being short for Distinguished Conduct Medal and VC being short for the Victoria Cross, which is the highest military honour in the British Army. John Goodman.
Because one of the conditions of a VC is that it has an impact on the outcome of the battle. So he did, like, at that crossroads where he set up that position, it's almost like that was the knuckle of the advance. That was that key point.
Thomas Fitzpatrick did something that was near impossible to do. And for it, he was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal.
Gerard Whelan.
But from what I've read, you know, I mean, I think he was slightly shortchanged, because what he did and organising his men and making that big defence, in my opinion, you know, he could have easily been awarded the Victoria Cross. Now he did get awards from France and Russia that equated to the Victoria Cross. But I think the British Army owed him that because it was their asses he saved at the end of the day.
All dramatic narrations in this radio documentary are by Martin Lewis. Now, what's clear from prior commentary is that Thomas Fitzpatrick played a seriously significant role in the 1914 Battle of Mons. In doing so, he ultimately helped to inspire the legend of the Angels of Mons, and this is his legacy.
Thomas Fitzpatrick, yes, he was awarded the DCM, and here's the narrative of the event, and this was in essence where the seeds were sown for the phenomenon that became the Angels of Mons legend.
The soldier who inspired the Angels of Mons legend more than any other was Thomas Fitzpatrick from Duncormac in County Wexford.
So yeah, Thomas Fitzpatrick was the inspiration for the legend of the Angels of Mons.
Funded by Comisiún na Man with the television licence fee.